There have been 5 major epochs defined by a major deflationary element. The baseline of human development is the age of subsistence or the period of hunting and gathering, when man lived basically as the beasts lived. In this situation, he took what he could from a basically hostile environment. Despite the earth being made for man, there is not much in the world that is suitable for human use as found. Air and water can be used as it comes to us, but even so, water is problematical as it is not always potable and may even be hazardous in situ. The flesh of animals needs to be cooked and prepared in some way if it is to be palatable, and all foods need to be protected from spoilage. Vegetable crops can be hard to harvest, difficult to process, and not always digestible in their natural form. The difficulty of finding sustenance made economic development difficult. Most of a person's time, in a subsistence culture, is spent in finding sustenance. This fact made it beneficial to steal the resources accumulated by weaker neighbors. This in turn makes the accumulation of resources not always as rewarding as it could have been. This is why this lifestyle is called subsistence. It is a term that refers to living hand to mouth, or from day to day. People trapped in this kind of life find it almost impossible to escape from. What broke some of us out of this cycle of poverty is the age of irrigation. The low end of this period is found in areas where irrigation was a natural phenomenon, such as the Nile Delta. However, what had to happen before this shift occurred is the rise of a strong man that could restrict appropriation to his own needs as a ruler. But once the benefits of natural irrigation on floodplains was understood, it was not a large step to develop large-scale irrigation systems. Along with this began the practice of agriculture. Crops were selected and prized seeds from these crops were preferentially planted and developed. But remember, behind this was the power of the state, to restrict predation to the needs of the state. The increased population that resulted from these measures enabled the community to accumulate resources, which enabled them to endure hard times and downturns in environmental conditions. But new crops and improved varieties only takes a nation so far. The industrial age ushered in technology, which multiplied the power of labor many times over. After this, there was the information age, which multiplied human intellectual capital. Now we're faced with AI and the changes this will bring. But these ages of innovation are shadowed by other elements that seem to promise much, but in the end collapsed under an inherent instability. The age of empires shadowed the ages of irrigation, agriculture, and industry. Armies wielding larger forces, better weapons and logistics, dominated the world but then passed into history as better armed or supplied armies took the field and defeated them. As bad as these empires were, the progress of man would not have occurred without them. But there were other forces in play that did not necessarily lead to economic advancement. Russia created an enormous contiguous empire with cheap labor and a totalitarian state. China and Japan tried to do the same. Venezuela used oil to deflate their economy only to collapse under a socialism that thought the wealth was unlimited. But all of these powers were cursed with the same issue that brought ruin to Spain. Cheap labor, oil, and gold only give a nation a short-term advantage. Even more broad-based deflation based on the invention of agriculture, steam power, and AI only gives a nation a limited advantage. Eventually, the world advances along the same lines and perhaps even surpasses the nation that originated the technology. If AI is permitted to be implemented without restrictions, the deflation may collapse the nation before it can adjust. For those trained in free market economics, deflation is the worst thing that can happen to an economy. Yet they must have missed something because economic development is deflation. Progress deflates prices. What is at issue is not deflation, which is basically a reevaluation of the value of labor vis-a-vis goods and services. It is the cost of money. When the cost of goods and services decline and the price of labor increases, workers get more product for a given portion of their labor. With inflation, the value of money declines and the worker gets less for a given unit of labor. The company can, under these conditions, pay its bills and make a profit. If money deflates, less money can buy the same basket of goods. If money increases in value, so that less money is needed for purchases, the supply of money will not need to increase. This impacts businesses and investors negatively, because lowering prices means the business is buying materials high and selling the finished good low. This has been happening for a long time with computers. But what has happened is that the lower cost has translated into more power and speed for the price. The actual selling price has not been impacted to the degree it would have had the product remained constant. In a deflationary economy, it becomes harder to pay down debt. A house purchased at $1 million with a $600,000 mortgage cannot be refinanced or sold if the value of such homes falls to $600,000. The only way prices can fall and productivity increase is through specialization. Advancements in technology and economies of scale are just ways of improving the level of specialization in the economy. The age of industrialization could not have happened without the age of agriculture, making it possible for millions of men to leave the land. The cost of food remains purchasable because the cost of labor per unit of food declined precipitously. Industrialization did the same for manufactured goods. Society has had to invent jobs to soak up surplus labor, even if the activity is not productive. Most of these make-work positions are in government. But such moves have had serious repercussions on the economy. Economic theory tells us there are producers and consumers. This is a poor way of representing the economy. To start with, there are no consumers and producers. There are economic units that do transactions. The basic economic unit is composed of two persons with their own specialized good or service. In short, all that is needed is a supply and demand, and the inherent ability of the market to reconcile one with the other. For this to happen, the market needs a unit of account or a way to track credits and debits. If a person consumes but does not produce, how does the market track the debits and credits of this account when one side of the ledger is missing? If a boat is sinking, or even in a race, and one or more persons are not bailing or rowing, the boat and crew are compromised. But is an economy any different than any other machine? But without a purpose, whether this is to stay afloat or win the race, how do we judge others? The Bible tells us not to judge unless we are judged by the metric that we judge others. We need a shared purpose and a common yardstick that a purpose can give us. If all we are trying to do is to get rich, stealing from others can appear to be a reasoned response to the problem. But it ought to be obvious that stealing, whether this is done within the law or in contravention of it, does not produce more wealth. Taxation is akin to allowing some to row without the or touching water. Taxation and government intervention generally is an attack on faith. Philosophers ask, in their ignorance of the subject, if there is truth. There are two answers, yes and no. But what philosophers do not get is that both responses are true. There is no truth in this world. The physical world is based on relativity. The concept of physicality assumes everything we know is the result of impingements on our senses, and so nothing can really be known. There is no direct way to ascertain the truth. Truth in this relativistic world is indirect, contingent, probabilistic, and, as said, relative. Those who are in this world will say that objective truth is not possible. Relativists deny God and the possibility of any solution to the world's problems. Any solution will be in the relativistic frame of reference, contingent, probabilistic, and relative. Mankind put himself in a world where he was able to prove only one thing: we cannot know the truth. But this absolute fact, and it is an absolute truth, disproves the very lies that we live in. Because if we can know we cannot know the truth, how do we know this? It is a paradox pointing to a higher truth. There is a higher truth, and it is founded on faith. Not the mindless faith of the probabilistic thinker, but the absolute faith founded on absolute truth. What is more certain that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4? We cannot see it or feel it because it is not real. This truth is analytical, some call it a tautology, but we have absolute faith in it. Others who can see the other world, even if dimly, argue for a world composed of absolute truth. These truths are moral, logical, and analytical. We call them a priorian. Those who know absolute truth know God. Those who know God knows there are solutions to this present world's problems, but to employ them requires entry into the other, perfect world of truth. That is because the problems we have are the system we are in. The differences in the systems are so profound we need to be born again to embrace the new reality. But so far, we have had no one to show us the way in. Anyone who tried to enter the other world has had blind guides to lead them. So even though they know there is another world and another reality, they will not be able to say much about it. But they have faith because they do see it, albeit dimly. Those of little faith have only a little sight. I see the new world with crystal clarity. Its details are visible. One thing the new world does not have is inflation. The world of truth is deflationary. In truth, a civilization is the product of deflationary activity. First of all, let's look at inflation. A simple but extreme case might be an economy with a bank, a politician, an employer, and a worker. The worker produces goods for the employer. He is paid a living wage, which in a sane world would mean the worker can purchase his output, minus the cost of the materials. Depreciation is not forgotten. It is actually not relevant in a sane world. Let's say the worker digs holes, and one hole takes an hour to dig, and so the worker is paid $10 per hour, so the holes he digs belong to him. The employer claims this is not fair as he provided the shovel, so the bank lends the employer $10, so the employer can pay the worker $10 due he can buy the hole he dug and use the borrowed money to pay himself $10. We now have $20 in one hole. The hole is now worth $20. But the government now says it needs to make laws governing how holes are dug and where. The employer must pay the state $5 per hole, and the employee needs to pay $5 per hole also out of his paycheck. Now the employer needs to borrow another $10 and give his employee a $5 per hole raise. We could also factor in the interest on the loan. For every $10 borrowed, $13 needs to be repaid. So as the loan is repaid, the economy lacks the money needed to pay each person the money owed them. So more money needs to be borrowed to keep the economy going. In short, the one hole is now valued at $30 plus interest. The interest keeps the cost going up without any increase in production. We still have only one hole being produced per hour, but it costs more and more over time. If everyone dug holes, we would have 4 holes and $40 as the payout. There would be no inflation. If the 4 persons increased production through advances in technology, skill, or specialization, the cost per hole would decline. That would be deflation. It is that simple. In other words, all things remaining the same, advances in technology, skill levels, specialization, or economies of scale, would produce a deflationary cycle. But deflation is feared like little else in economics. This has a lot to do with what we passed over in the discussion above, namely depreciation. In the normal course of events, a capitalist amasses capital and invests it in a business. The elements of business need replacing and upgrading, and so everything in the business has a lifespan, and so needs periodical replacing. The expected lifespan of the article and its cost of replacement spread out over the life of the item is called its rate of depreciation. The way the capitalist sees it, he invested a sizable amount of money in setting up the business. In the process of producing goods and services, there are many things that will need to be replaced. Plus, there is the cost of his time, and so we get to the idea of profitability. The business needs to make enough money to turn a profit. The profit reimburses the capitalist for his investment in time and money and provides him with the funds needed to replace the tools of the business as they become outdated. This right to charge what the market will bear is problematical, but probably the least of our problems, economically speaking. The question is, how many people will tolerate another person raking in most of the benefits when they do all the work? Depeast whatever rationalization capitalists use to justify their appropriation of the biggest slice of the pie. How many workers will accede to this were there no state to protect private ownership? This is mentioned because despite what capitalists say about the state, they need and want it just as much as any welfare recipient. Without the state, they would not have their private property nor the ability to determine their own relative worth, vis-a-vis those who labor for them. The problem of capitalism does not reside with their ability to decide what work needs doing or what each job is worth. The problem of capitalism is their dependency on the state. So let's look at this. We can postulate that no one who is not a parasite needs the state, at least for no other reason than to regulate the activity of parasites. The person who works does not need the state. This is a very profound statement. It means that the state is not needed except by parasites, which also suggests that if we look at those who need the state, we will find those whom the dutiful do not need. Those who work do not need the state, nor the ones who need the state. Therefore, there is a line of demarcation between those who are dutiful and have faith and parasites. The Bible declares that the man who does not work, neither shall he eat. This is a clear condemnation of parasites. For either we work and pay our own way, or we survive off of the work of others. There is no middle ground. We need to understand the greater the parasitism, the higher the inflation, and conversely, the lower the rate of parasitism, the greater the tendency for the economy to deflate. which tends to beg the question as to why the economy hates deflation as much as it does. To this, there can only be one answer, the same one we alluded to above. Inflation is a measure of parasitism. Deflation is a measure of equality. Parasites cannot exist in a meritocracy of an economy in which equality is present. The state needs inflation as does its supporters, whether these are on the right or the left. In the coming of deflation, there will be equality, and with this security for those who create the wealth. No claim will be tolerated against property which the claimant did not create, and no payment for work not done will be made nor payment withheld for work done. This is the only viable definition of equality. All persons own what they create, and no one has access to anything they did not create, other than to add value to it.